This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, leadership, federal court, and forensic odontology. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode number 14 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. A few weeks ago, Joanna Penn on the Creative Penn podcast was talking about Patreon. She said, "I think patronage is one of the most powerful things that you can do to support creators that you want to continue hearing from. It's one of those ways that you can support people and encourage them to do the things that are either useful to you or just putting good stuff in the world." Regardless of whether you support me on Patreon, I absolutely think you, as a creator of stories, should look into setting up your own Patreon account. You can learn more at writersdetective.com/Patreon, Patreon. And as always, thanks to my patrons, Joan Raymond, Guy Alton, Natasha Bajema, Natalie Borelli, Joe Trent, Siobhan Pope, Leah Cutter, and Kim Hunt Harris. They support me, and I hope you will support them as well. You can find links to their author websites in the show notes by going to writersdetective.com/14. I recorded this episode last week while out on the road, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but I should have published it last Friday. But like many things we try to accomplish, life sometimes gets in the way. Shit happens. Whether it's producing podcasts, writing, dieting, exercise, or anything we try to accomplish, there's an important concept to learn here, and I want you to remember this and make it your mantra. Never miss twice. Say it again with me. Now, mutter it under your breath if you have to, if you're like on a train or sitting somewhere with someone who's listening to you. But say it again. Never miss twice. Now, happy November, by the way, or NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, as many of you will think of November. So I want you to remember as well that you are not alone in this for NaNoWriMo. If you get stuck with your story, come find us in the Writers Detective Q&A group on Facebook to get unstuck. You can literally search Writers Detective Q&A group. But get after those daily word counts, and if life gets in the way of your daily writing, don't let it derail you for the whole month. Just get back to it the next day. Remember, never miss twice. All right, now let's get into episode 14. Yesterday, I drove from Southern California up to Marin, California, just north of San Francisco, to join my mother in hearing former FBI Director James Comey speak. The core of his lecture was on the topic of leadership. Now, he initially talked about two pairs of leadership traits. The first pair are kindness and toughness, and they go hand in hand. And the second pair, confidence and humility. Toughness without kindness is cruelty. Kindness without toughness is just as bad when we're talking about leadership. It's weakness. It's the inability to make a decision or the inability to affect change that needs to happen. It can lead to you being easily taken advantage of. As for confidence, now this did not come from Director Comey, but one of my favorite quotes is, "Cockiness is thinking you're superior. Confidence is knowing you're not inferior." And then the balance to that confidence is humility. And one of the ways you can spot if a person has humility when we're talking about a leader is by looking at those who flourished, became leaders themselves after working for a leader with humility. Leaders with humility do not seek glory or praise. They defer that to the workers below them that deserve that praise and that work, rather than being glory hounds. But leaders with humility will shoulder all the blame when things go wrong. The reason I'm talking about this, besides the fact that it was the FBI director that was having this conversation, was that when we typically think of leadership, we think of bosses. Now, it's key to understand that management or managing, you manage work, but you lead people. We have a lot of managers, but in my experience, we're a little short on leaders. But every cop is a leader. The very first time you step into a living room to settle a domestic dispute, guess who the leader in that room is? It's you, the one with the badge, the one who's making the rules, who's laying down the law, quite literally, as to what's going to happen. So as you create and grow your law enforcement officer protagonists, recognize and kind of bake in those leadership traits into those characters, because that balance of kindness and toughness, confidence and humility is what really makes a great cop and a great leader. Now, of course, most of the people that attended this talk weren't there to hear about leadership. They had questions they wanted answered about current events, especially with regard to the fact that he was fired by the president, and he played quite a role in how the election turned out. And this is not a political podcast. I really respect your own opinion, and I'm not going to go off on any kind of political tangents. But what I found really interesting, when Director Comey was asked about the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and in particular his decision to disclose the reopening of the case due to newly discovered evidence, he explained that in the post-Watergate, post-J. Edgar Hoover era, that a chief concern for any FBI director is the appearance of impropriety, and especially as it relates to concealing the facts. That concealment was one of the major causes of distrust of the FBI. And the FBI has spent decades trying to repair and rebuild the confidence that the American people have in the Department of Justice in general and the FBI in particular, with regards to trust with the American people. So he explained that he really had two choices, a fork in the road, two doors to choose from. And the first door was transparency, to tell the American people what was going on. And obviously that was the door he chose. Or door number two was concealment, to not bring it to light. And he was fundamentally against that, based upon his belief of what the FBI stood for. And he did say that both doors led to hell, or at least that was one of the quotes from someone in his office. What I found interesting was that he told the audience if he had to make that decision all over again, he would make the same decision. He just could not see concealing those facts as something that was of value. And because the FBI's decisions must be independent of politics, and because they should never be viewed as favoring, they being the FBI, should never be viewed as favoring a particular party or candidate. In what was clearly true candor and reflection, he said, "I just don't see taking the choice of concealment." And he seemed really flustered, and he tried to explain that he knows it may not make sense to the audience from the perspective of looking back up the path from where we are now to that fork in the road where he had to make that decision alone. It's quite a formidable thing for an FBI director to have to make that decision. But the fact that he referenced staying above the politics, being nonpartisan and being independent and being the voice of reason and being the voice of doing the right thing, the best way I can explain this is it is a Kantian ethical principle, or deontology. And so what I'm trying to say here is, normally when we talk about an ethical decision, very often we think in the very basic terms of utilitarianism. So what the consequentialist theory, I know I'm throwing a lot of philosophical terms at you here, but essentially most people will simply say, does this benefit, which action benefits the most people? And if it benefits the most people, then that's the ethical decision to make. So the counter argument to that, which Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, argued, is that there are some actions that you have a duty to make, regardless of the outcome, regardless of the end result, regardless of the consequences. It's the action itself is either moral or it is not. And there is a categorical imperative to this that it has to be equally applicable. So it would not be ethical if you had a duty, if you felt that this duty was right if you did it, but not right if someone else did it to you. It's kind of that golden rule theory. But if we all agreed that we were all in the same position and we hold that transparency in government to be an important thing, then even though as tough a decision as it is, and the consequences being the election and all of that kind of stuff, that can't factor into that decision making. You either have a duty to do this thing or you don't. So it was really fascinating to me that was his thinking, that it was a true deontological argument, which a lot of cops they go through this decision-making process on a regular basis, but they may not have the philosophical terms for it. A lot of times you will hear them referred to as the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. And that's kind of that same balance between utilitarianism, consequentialist ethical theory, or deontology, that Kantian ethics. So I found it neat, being a nerd in this regard, to actually see the former director of the FBI, literally explain that he was using a Kantian principle to make the right decision. So whether that was the right decision or not, I will leave to, I'm sure, the comments, but at the very least the history books, and all the other arguing that's going on social media that I tend to avoid. But anyway, I wanted to share that with you. So that was the reason I was in Northern California. But earlier this week, I posed a "Where am I?" question on social media. I did it through Instagram and Facebook, so if you follow me on either of those, you'd have seen part of my head and this interesting mirrored-looking architecture behind me. And then I dropped a clue to try to help you guys out, and that was, of course, City Hall from Los Angeles, which you would recognize if you had ever seen an episode of Dragnet. But I want to give a big congratulations to James Patrick Joyce. He won a Writer's Detective coffee mug for guessing my location. So I was in front of the brand spanking new United States Courthouse, also known as Federal Court. So I was down there to testify in a federal case. So it would be a good time to explain that in the United States, we have a body of laws that are federal law. They're nationwide laws. Normally under the United States Code. So those would be the laws that the FBI or the DEA or the U.S. Marshals, those are the agencies that are enforcing federal laws. And then at the state level, we have our own state laws, state penal code. So if I am testifying, well, as a local peace officer, a police officer, I make arrest for robbery, I'm going to be testifying in the local superior court where it is a state charge for a state robbery crime. My prosecutor may be a district attorney. It may be a state's attorney if you're on a different jurisdiction other than California. It could also be the state attorney general's office that is the prosecutor. But then when you're at the federal level, it is the United States Attorney that is the prosecutor. But those are literally two separate legal systems, to the point where if you're convicted of a state robbery crime, you are going to state prison, which is in our case, a California prison. If you are convicted of a federal crime, you are going to go to a federal prison, a United States penitentiary. Or a federal correctional institution, which, they jokingly call Club Fed, the little play on Club Med terminology. But so I was down in Los Angeles to testify in this brand new, beautiful federal court building. And when it was actually an interesting experience because I've never seen a courtroom with this layout before. When you walk into a courtroom, in the United States, somewhere along the back wall, it may be the corner, I've seen it in the middle of the room, but normally along the back wall, the focal point of the courtroom is usually the judge. And where the judge sits is called the bench. And then to one side or the other will be the jury box. And that's obviously where the jury of your peers will sit and listen to testimony and evidence, and at some point will come to a decision about the guilt or innocence of the person charged. So depending upon which side of the room the jury box is located, let's say it's on the right wall as we walk through the front doors of the courtroom, the judge is straight ahead of us, and the jury box is off to the right. Between the jury box and the judge, off to the judge's side, is usually the witness stand. So that way you're roughly equal distance from both the jury and the judge, and that way everybody can hear you when you're giving testimony. Directly in front of that witness stand, usually down a little bit below, because that witness stand is up on a riser often by about a foot or two, will be the court reporter, also known as a stenographer. Then the attorneys, the prosecutor always sits on the side closest to the jury. And then the defense table is the opposite one. So typically, going back to our example of the way the tables are laid out, the prosecutor's table, in this case it would be on the right because the jury box is on the right, and the defense table would be on the left. Those tables are usually parallel to the bench. So that way the attorneys and the defendant, everybody is looking straight ahead at the judge. In this federal courtroom, and apparently this is the layout for this new building, the counsel tables, the attorneys' tables, face one another. So when I walked in that door and I have that judge straight ahead, I have attorneys' tables that are perpendicular to the bench. So the prosecutor actually has his or her back to the jury box. It was just a really weird layout, but it was a beautiful building and quite the interesting layout. And I figured you might be interested in hearing how the courtroom is laid out and how attorneys know where to go. So if you are a prosecutor on your first day and you walk into a courtroom, you have to look to see where the jury box is, and then you take the table closest to the jury box. And finally, this week in our Facebook Writers Detective Q&A group, which you can find by going to Facebook and entering Writers Detective Q&A into the search bar. And Writers Detective is one word for this group. It's a closed group, but if you click on the join link, you'll be given a couple questions to answer, and I will get you added as soon as I can. We would love to have you in there. But this week's question comes from James Beach, who you can find on Amazon, and I will be sure to include a link to his Amazon page in the show notes. James asks, when investigators are trying to confirm a body's former identity by comparing it to dental records, how are the original dental records found? I mean, how would an investigator even know what dentists that person might have gone to? Or alternatively, do dentists routinely send their dental records to some central location with patient ID or something else that police can search? Now, there were quite a few people. Tink and RJ both gave some great answers to this. The short answers are that you do need to have a potential identity of this person to begin with. So if there's no central record system for dental here in the United States, when we're dealing with a missing persons case, if that person has been missing for an extended period of time, we will ask the family or the person that made the report to see if we can get connected with the dentist and try to get dental records, x-rays, castings, whatever we can get to have on file if and when we have to try to make a identity determination based upon dental records. And RJ explained that dental records help us to make an identification when we suspect who it is, but do not have other ways to confirm the identity. He said, for example, we had a car crash and fire that killed 4 college kids in one vehicle. They were all unidentifiable. From the VIN number on the car, we knew who owned the car. From talking to students and professors on campus, we figured out who might be in the car with the owner. Then we went to the 4 families to find out what dentists they used, and finally, an odontologist confirmed the IDs of the bodies. Then I chimed in to say it isn't just the dental work done, meaning not just a record of root canals and placement of teeth, but also the bite pattern itself. And forensic odontologists can cast the decedent's teeth as a mold if they have enough teeth, just like you would if you're getting tooth whitening trays. And they can also then compare the bite pattern to the dental records. And I talked about when I attended homicide school, where a forensic odontologist was teaching a course. He showed us a case where he had made a bite mark comparison between a mold cast from a suspect's teeth and bite marks on a decedent's body. So if this sounds even remotely interesting to you, I highly recommend checking out abfo.org, and that stands for American Board of Forensic Odontology. So abfo.org. Of course, the link will be in the show notes, but that way you can go down the rabbit hole of learning all about forensic odontology. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Writers Detective Bureau podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe. If you belong to a writers group, in person or online, I would love it if you'd share this podcast. This podcast is created for you. So don't be shy and submit your crime fiction questions, or just say hello at writersdetective.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening. Write well.